Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Australian National University's Chancellor's Panel, the Frontiers of Artificial Intelligence. May I first acknowledge the first Australians on whose traditional lands and indeed airwaves we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm joining you from our beautiful campus in Canberra, located on Ngunnawal Ngambri land. Now, today's panel is part of the 2022 ANU Alumni Week. It's one of more than 20 alumni events, so I encourage everyone to make the most of all the online discussions and on-campus activities. Alumni Week is particularly special this year as we continue to celebrate ANU's 75th anniversary. We are the first and indeed the only national university. We were founded by a single act of Parliament in 1946 to help Australia recover from the global crisis of World War II, with a mission to strengthen the social and economic fabric of our nation and establish Australia's place in the world. More than ever, our mission remains critical to Australia's interests. And as we emerge from another global crisis, the COVID pandemic, the world has been shaken by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the resulting humanitarian crisis. It's also sent shockwaves through energy and commodity markets, while there are concerns about global financial stability. And these crises come at a time of great change and disruption, driven in large part by the fourth industrial revolution, the technology revolution. While that's already had a profound impact on how we live and work, experts predict that the greatest changes actually still lie ahead. It's in these inflection moments for which ANU was founded, and our responsibility for supporting policymakers in charting their way through these turbulent times. Now, one of the key drivers of the technology revolution is artificial intelligence, and I am delighted to be joined by three leading women in the field, all of whom are working to ensure AI supports a more sustainable future. We have a most distinguished panel today, and they will discuss the impacts and frontiers of artificial intelligence and look at the future trends, opportunities, and threats to be considered. So I'm pleased to welcome distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell, Professor Elanor Huntington, and Mikaela Jade. Distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell is Director of the School of Cybernetics and the 3A Institute at ANU, and she's Vice President and Senior Fellow in the Advanced Research and Development Labs at Intel Corporation. Genevieve holds a PhD in Cultural Anthropology from Stanford University. She's a renowned anthropologist, technologist, and futurist. She spent more than 2 decades in Silicon Valley helping to guide Intel's product development and social science and design research capabilities. Genevieve is best known for her work at the intersection of cultural practice and technology development, and for being an important voice in the global debates around artificial intelligence and human society. So thanks for joining us here today, Genevieve. Now, Professor Elanor Huntington, our former Dean of the ANU College of Engineering and Computer Science, currently a visiting professor with the college. Elanor is an ANU alumna, having studied physics in 1996, graduating with a university medal. And in 2000, she completed her PhD in experimental quantum optics. Elanor is currently the Executive Director of Digital National Facilities and Collections at CSIRO. She's committed to growing the profile of engineering in the community. She's a passionate advocate for developing STEM skills, and it's always a pleasure to welcome you back to ANU, Elanor, and I'm glad your new role is just a stone's throw from our campus. Finally, I welcome Mikaela Jade, who comes from the world's oldest storytellers, a Cabrogal woman of the Darug speaking nations of Sydney. Mikaela is a skilled communicator and connector. Mikaela is widely recognised as a leader in the technology space. She's named on the Australians 100 Top Innovators list and the 2021 Indigenous Leader of the Year at the Women in Digital Awards. Mikaela is also an ANU alumna. She completed a Master of Applied Cybernetics with commendation last year at the ANU School of Cybernetics. Mikaela's company, Indigital, founded in 2014, is Australia's first Indigenous Edutech company. Indigital is built on the belief that together we can use digital technologies, including virtual, augmented, and mixed realities, to help preserve and proliferate 80,000 years of human knowledge. Mikaela and Indigital also work towards engaging First Nations peoples in education, and that will lead to skills, jobs, and wealth creation to build a stronger future for all. So welcome back, Mikaela. Now, we will have some time for Q&A with our audience later on, and you'll use the platforms on Zoom to indicate that you have a question. So please put your questions up now. But first of all, I'm going to start the discussion with a few questions of my own to the panel. This one's for all of you. And perhaps I'll start with Genevieve, then go to Elanor and Mikaela. But first of all, we are experiencing a transformative period in the interaction between technology and society. There's an ongoing debate about the positive and negative impacts of technology. So how do we ensure AI, artificial intelligence, works to the benefit of all humanity? Easy one. Genevieve, perhaps you can start.
Yeah, that's such an easy question, Chancellor. I think there's a couple of pieces that you have to be sort of unpacking out of that question, right? The first piece is, how do we ensure that we are generating and training the widest diversity of people to be skilled practitioners in this space, so that we are creating lots of different voices who are skilled at using AI? I think there's a piece about how do we upskill your former colleagues? So how do we think about upskilling regulators and public servants and civil servants so that they can be better informed as they make policy? And then I think there's also an argument about how do we ensure that we are really thinking carefully about the places where AI is most useful and where it isn't. And for me, that's a broad swath of things, right? Yes, it's absolutely about Industry 4.0 and next generation sort of ideas about how we do better technology work and better productivity tools. But I also think there are some really interesting ways that we can use AI in education, in the arts and creative sector, in the sort of sustainability and climate change space. So for me, it's about those three things, right? How do you ensure you have a really rich mix of people in the conversation? How do you make sure our regulators are really skilled so that they're solving for the right problems? And then how do you think maybe laterally and not just literally about where the places are you might want to put AI?
Thanks, Genevieve. Now, Elanor, over to you on this topic, this general opening question about AI working to the benefit of all humanity.
Thanks, Chancellor. And I will start off by echoing and reinforcing all of Genevieve's points. They are incredibly important. And I guess to bring to add over the top of that, one of the things that I would argue is that if you cut all the way back to what is the purpose of engineering, what is engineering about? If you go looking through history, engineering disciplines are created at exactly those moments where there's simultaneous technological and societal and oftentimes economic disruption. And it's because we've got and one of the things that's going on there is we've got a bunch of creative people playing with new pieces of technology and trying to solve interesting new problems. Engineering disciplines emerge at that same time, and I would argue that if you cut right to the heart of what is engineering is about technological trust at scale. And so to me, a key supplement to the points that Genevieve has made is to also say that what we really need to be doing here is focusing on what would make a new engineering discipline where we are able to engage with what is a very powerful piece of technology and bring trust to that at scale, so that it is operating in society in ways that we all understand and believe.
Great. Mikaela, perhaps you can comment now on this opening question about ensuring AI is working to the benefit of all humanity.
Thank you, Chancellor. And how can you follow Genevieve and Elanor after their amazing responses to that question, which is a very deep question? The way I'm thinking about AI to benefit all of humanity is to bring it back to country and bring it back to my people who have 80,000 years of science, technology, engineering, mathematics in our DNA. And thinking about what would make AI something that is uniquely Australian as well, instead of relying on artificial intelligence systems that are developed overseas and essentially Uberify industries in Australia. So bringing our people along on the journey, allowing us space to dream and think and do in AI is going to be really important, I think, because our old people thought about cataclysmic change in human societies, and we've been through it a number of times. So we do have strategies in place within our cultures to deal with rapid changes and advancements in technologies. And I think we have a lot to learn from our people about how to embed this into artificial intelligence engineering.
That's great. Thank you. Now, Genevieve, back to you. Developments in AI are occurring at a rapid pace. How can we ensure that AI development remains within ethical boundaries? And I know that this is an issue troubling people around the world. What's your response to the ethical boundaries within which AI development should occur?
Listen, it's such a good question, Chancellor. And I think one of the places there we need to kind of stop and take a step back is to ask ourselves what we think the ethical framework is in the first place, right? One of the things that happens when we talk about ethics is everyone nods along and we all think we're all agreeing that we have the same shared ethical framework, and of course we don't. I was just looking at the class notes for a colleague of mine who's teaching in the systems engineering core here in the college, and he has a slide that basically said, ethics is not a mathematical equation. It's not something you can hardwire into a system. It's actually a constant conversation, and it's a conversation about what do we value as a society, what are the things that we care about, what are the places and the problematics that are most important to us. And of course, if you think about it, for any one of us, anywhere across this Zoom call, right, the ethical framework that we grew up in Australia X number of years ago has changed a little bit to where we find ourselves now. And so thinking about how do we ensure that the kind of technical systems we build are ethical means that we actually have to have multiple conversations and upskill multiple people in those conversations. And for me, it's more than just saying we should teach our engineers and computer scientists, we should send them through an ethics course. It's usually not enough, right? We actually should be thinking about how do we equip all of our social actors, so whether it's our engineers or our lawyers, with an ability to be able to have these conversations. So for me, it's about how do you go back in some ways to first principles? How do we think about why the system is being built, in whose interests it's being built, who's being erased or celebrated by it, and what are the consequences of all of that? And then how do we think about what that system will look like over time? Which means, partly where unsurprisingly, Elanor started too. For me, at least, as we think about a world with AI systems, it actually requires establishing a new branch of engineering that has at its core a very different set of skills and practices. And so one of the things we've been doing at the ANU since Elanor and Brian invited me back here in 2017 is working out how you build a new branch of engineering to do precisely that, to take AI to scale responsibly and safely and sustainably. And for me, that means making new kinds of engineers. It means staging new kinds of conversations. It does mean upskilling the regulators. And I think it means having extraordinary students, of which I'm very happy Mick is one of them. And we have a whole collection of 50 plus other people who have also brought through this program, and lots of people that we're training through micro-credentials. But for me, it's about how do you change the conversation, but also create skills that make that change lasting.
Now, Elanor, let's think about artificial intelligence and global security. What are the future trends, the opportunities, the threats? How can we prevent an AI arms race between hostile or even competing powers?
That too is a very large question, and I'm conscious that I'm being asked it by Australia's former foreign minister. So not intimidated at all, but I'll have a go. And I guess if one reads the thinking of the people who are thinking about strategy and what that means on the world stage at the moment, one of the conversations that's live at the moment is where is globalization going to go, and one of the ways that framing this up is to think in terms of, well, there are potentially four scenarios here. One of which is essentially complete fragmentation, and the idea that there is, while we may be an international globe, we're not necessarily globalized at all. On the other end, complete globalization, which is where people thought that we were sitting on the cusp of just before the events of the last couple of years, and then intermediate stages where we end up with not complete fragmentation, but at least more tightly bound groups that have some friction between them, and there are some obvious consequences to doing that, and that will of course play out in terms of the way that ideas flow around, the way that technology flows around, the way that everything flows around. And the thing that I tend to look towards is, okay, well, so if what can we learn from the past? And what we learned from the past is that when people created technology previously that caused a deal of anxiety on the global stage, like, for example, nuclear weapons, it was not necessarily the nuclear weapons that prevented us from entering into a global catastrophe. It was people who were thinking about strategy on the grand stage and thinking about the way that human beings and the way that nation states or groups of nation states would react to each other, knowing that they had different types of particular technology. So, I mean, that's kind of a grim way of thinking about it, which is artificial intelligence being used and weaponized. But and we need to think about that. And there are, in fact, the UN has just released, in fact, a set of global norms for the way that people should operate in cyberspace. And artificial intelligence, as we know, breaks through out of cyberspace and into the physical world quite a lot. And that's a lot of the work that Genevieve and Mikaela are thinking about. But there's also a key part of cyberspace in that. But I think there's the downside of thinking about just the grim side is that it does indeed slow down the flow of ideas, and there's a lot of benefit to be had in terms of thinking about the way that people from other cultures perhaps approach technology. And I'm also conscious that I'm saying that in front of one of the world's foremost anthropologists. So I'm a little cautious about that as well. But there are things to be learned from the way that other people think about technology. And Mikaela foregrounded that right at the start of the conversation. And there are some amazing positive things to be done there. So to me, the challenge in all of these things is to think through how we keep our understanding of the way that people and different people approach these technologies in the way we think about this all of the time. This is not a technological conversation. It is as much about the people. And if we have time later on, we may get an opportunity to talk about how we are observing some of that unfold, unfortunately, live in the Ukraine right now. There's a lot of stuff going on there that I think many of us are watching very closely. But I'd like to finish on the positive side, which is that, in fact, we can learn so much from each other, and we need to be thinking about those positive global trends as well. That's what's going to keep us together.
Elanor, thank you for that answer. The reason I asked you was precisely because it was the sort of issue that troubled me when I was Foreign Minister, and will continue to trouble policymakers for some time. I'm encouraging people who are online to put in your questions for our very distinguished expert panel. So please put in some questions. And Elanor, we might come back to you after about the UN. I'm interested to know how much support the UN's principles and guidance have received, other member states in the main subscribing to it, because, I remember being on forums just about the internet, and there were two very different camps, the Western liberal democracies and the authoritarian states who just couldn't agree on anything. So we might just come back to you on that after I ask this next question to Mikaela. Now, Mikaela, development of the so-called metaverse is well underway. So how important is it to include a range of perspectives in the future of AI? You mentioned earlier the Indigenous voices. How do we do that? How important is it?
So something that we've been doing at Indigital, Chancellor, is going around the country. We worked with over 7,000 young people and 160 teachers and many Indigenous communities, showing them what metaverse type technologies looks like. And trying to describe augmented reality is actually quite difficult. I've been trying to do it since 2012 unsuccessfully, and really the turnkey was being able to put it in people's hands and let them have a play of it. The response is our people instantaneously understand the concepts of the metaverse because they relate so well to the way that we express our cultures in the physical world as well. So we have decentralized decision making. We see information in the landscape in more than 3 dimensions. So it aligns really well with our way of knowing, being and doing. So getting it into our hands is something that I am a huge advocate for, because we need to see it in order to understand how we can help build it, how we can help shape it. There's another dimension to me as a practitioner as well. I'm a female or a woman, and I've had some pretty ghastly experiences as a woman in the metaverse so far. Like, the metaverse itself is not essentially built yet, but the technologies that underpin it are. So, for example, I've been a hologram presenting over on the other side of the country in Western Australia from my home in Canberra, and I've put my head down and seen a holographic colleague in my crutch. So there's a lot of things about the metaverse that haven't considered the female perspective, or haven't considered other cultures' perspectives of what is appropriate and what's not, in terms of even just thinking about distances where avatars can meet in social spaces, and how we can think about issues that come from the physical world and we import them inadvertently into the digital realm through unconscious bias, or just not thinking about what people's experience might be. And I can't see myself as a Cabral woman in metaverse type technologies yet, because there's not very many of us in there designing things like avatars, things like environments, things like proximity and what's appropriate culturally for people to be together. We've been working with Māori community on cultural protocols in the metaverse too, and they have different perspectives on what's okay and what's not okay from my people. So as Darug Mob, my elders are saying we don't want to use AI to express our dead people as holograms, whereas some Māori community that we've been working with saying that's okay as long as they're holograms with only other dead people and not alive people. So there's lots of different cultural norms that we need to really unpack if it's going to be a safe and responsible and ethical place for everybody to work, play and interact with on the metaverse.
Thank you for that answer. You raised some profoundly challenging issues, and that's why forums such as today's are so important. We've got to keep teasing out these issues and sharing the experiences, negative and positive, and ensure that we can hold people to a responsibility, a standard that is hopefully acceptable across the board. Can I stay with you, Mikaela, and just ask a question for all the panel, but I'll start with you and then go back to Elanor and Genevieve. Mikaela, talk about the potential from your perspective that AI holds for educational institutions and student learning. Let's bring it back to campus. So what do you see as the potential for AI for educational institutions, universities, schools, student learning?
I'm really excited about the potential of AI to help the education system bridge some pretty massive gaps. Not being able to see AI is one thing. So educating people, as Genevieve and Elanor have said, about AI and how its use is very needed in the education sector before we embark on just deploying AI to help students learn. I think parents and students deserve the right to understand what data is being used to drive education, what might be recorded about them. I know that there's some pilot education programs internationally that have had AI deployed in the classroom for 5 years that are basically collecting data on these students as they grow up. And questions from me would be, well, what are you going to do with that data? What happens to the data from my child from when they were 5 and they might have expressed learning difficulties to when they're an adult? What happens to that? Do they want that unearthed as an adult, for example? My children are asking me that about Facebook stuff already. So, I think there's potential. I think we need to really make sure that there's an open conversation and consent, though, before we start deploying AI across the education system. I mean, it's already used by some degrees, but I think we need a lot more work in that space. And as we work with teachers across Australia, it's abundantly clear that teachers have a very large digital literacy gap when it comes to technologies, and they're almost sometimes scared of some of the technologies because no one's invested in their upskilling and training. So that's probably a role that ANU could play across the board, is bringing more teachers back to learn about this.
I think it absolutely has to be a partnership between governments, the universities, the education sector, the private sector. We need a partnership here for the reskilling, upskilling, re-educating. Elanor, your thoughts on the potential for AI in educational institutions, student learning?
So I guess I would go back to a comment that Genevieve made about being really thoughtful about where one deploys this technology. And I guess for me, one of the things that I see a lot of when AI gets used particularly in terms of mediating the way that people engage with each other or with technology or with ideas, is that it creates a world that is very deep, but not very wide sometimes, and that's great. In a circumstance where you just need to get some feedback from a particular engagement that you're having with, say, a set of learning ideas or something like that. It's great for providing that feedback. It's great for flagging that you might just need to spend a little bit more time on this particular idea, and it can potentially chart a path through a very complicated set of concepts that, if you happen to fall into one of a particular set of categorizations of the way that people think about things, it may actually accelerate your learning journey. But if you do not happen to fall into one of those categories, then it's going to create a very high friction and potentially not great learning experience. And I guess that's what I mean by deep rather than wide. And so for me, one of the key things is I've actually observed some education institutions attempt to break up an entire undergraduate degree into small bite-sized chunks and think of it as a connected network of ideas, and then help guide students through artificial intelligence through that set of ideas to accelerate their pathway through that. I will admit it's a very engineering way of thinking about this, but and it potentially has its benefits, but it also potentially has its downsides. And to me, that's a really good example of being incredibly thoughtful about where you deploy these technologies. Sometimes even when you think that it's a great place to deploy it, you definitely need a kill switch that says, this is not working for me, I need to find a different way.
Genevieve, your thoughts, having heard Mikaela and Elanor, your thoughts?
Oh, I was sitting here just whimpering pathetically at Eleanor's vision of, we're going to break education down in little tiny pieces, and you go here, 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 and thinking, oh God.
Not my vision, just saying.
Oh, that's good, Dean Huntington, because I have questions if that's your vision. Because I think one of the things that we often forget in talking about these conversations, and it's something that always comes through mixed work that I really appreciate, is that most learning, when done inside a broader cultural context, is not an individual engaging in learning by themselves. It's an individual in community, an individual with a context. I'm willing to bet for almost everyone on this Zoom call somewhere, you learned as much from the people that were in the classroom with you as you did from your faculty. And there's something about the kind of relentless logic of an atomized education. This is going to be everyone's individualized experience that forgets that, in fact, part of what education does is not just communicate information, but communicate context. And that context is often, deeply social and rich in that way, and stripping it down to an individual journey is really kind of messy. But I guess, Chancellor, the other thing I keep thinking about is that in order to imagine having an AI-ready society, which I think in some ways is what that question is aimed at, we also have to be willing to say you'd need to invest not just in kind of digital literacy, but actually in a set of other core conversations. So how do we ensure that people are able to engage in critical thinking? How do people know to ask about the history of things and the context of things? Conversations that historically have been housed in the humanities and the social sciences, which often really suffer when we start to overemphasize STEM. And for me, I kind of want to think about, in order to imagine what AI looks like in an educational context, I actually want to imagine how do we invest across all of those pieces of the puzzle? Because I think when you listen to both Mick and Elanor, you would find that in order to be good in context with AI, you actually also need to be good at all these other pieces of the puzzle. And I really worry that we sometimes think that if we just invest in STEM, it will fix it all, rather than saying, actually, it's a more holistic systems focus we need to take, and there's some other pieces of the puzzle we want to emphasize.
Now, Genevieve, I'll just stay with you for the moment. I've got my final question, then I can see we have a number of questions from our online audience. But again, a question for the panel, and I'm not sort of going down the sci-fi path, but what is the potential for machines to become so super intelligent and capable of developing their own consciousness that there's a possibility of humans eventually losing control? Now, is that a possibility? And if so, what safeguards can be put in place? I'll start with you, Genevieve, then Elanor, then Mikaela.
Okay, so that notion is sometimes called the singularity. So the idea of a point where machines and human consciousness kind of reach an inflection point. The man responsible for coining that kind of notion and for propelling that as a conversation is a man named Ray Kurzweil, who these days I think is still at Google. Ray's first notion of when the singularity was going to hit was in the last century. Last I checked, he'd pushed it out into the 2050s, 2060s range. And I suspect that's because whilst that is a deeply seductive story, and it's a seductive story because in the West, at least, we have the Frankenstein narrative and the Golem narrative and the Terminator narrative that give us lots of ways that preoccupy us about what will happen when that comes to be. The reality is what it would take in terms of technological apparatus to have that happen is far further away than you think. And possibly that's actually more obvious to people 2 years into the pandemic than it might have been at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm willing to bet that every single person here has had the moment of going, why can't I connect to this Zoom call? Why is this QR code so hard to use? What the hell is this app? How do I make this thing work? And then you think, the notion that the machinery is going to get to full consciousness is a little bit further down the track yet. And there are questions I'd want to ask sooner than that, actually, Chancellor. The things that worry me long before machines getting to consciousness or code getting to consciousness has to do with how we have better conversations about the energy footprint that is required even for the systems we have now. You know, what is the percentage of energy expended on the planet just to hold the data we have, let alone imagining what is coming? For me, are kind of questions we could be asking in the present about how we want to contemplate our kind of relationship with tech rather than a very particular anxiety that says, oh my God, one day it's going to be smart enough and we will be displaced.
Well, Elanor, our futurist, has just brought me back to ground. So your thoughts on singularity in that general context, is it something we should even be thinking about at present?
So if you'll forgive me for a moment, I will become the pragmatic engineer, which is that one of the things as an experimental physicist or an engineer is that you learn very quickly that theorists' ideas about infinity are not true. The thing that in order to get to infinity, in order to get to exponential runaway and exponential growth that goes forever is exactly this issue that Genevieve's touched on, which is that in order to do that, you actually need infinite resources to fuel it. And those infinite resources are going to be infinite amounts of energy, infinite amounts of compute power, infinite amounts of silicon. And if nothing else, the last couple of years when issues to do with a pandemic and we are now really, really living the beginnings of what climate change means for us, we do not live in an infinite planet. Everything is connected. There is a finite set of resources. And that means that a theoretical concept of infinite runaway is, we are now starting to see that is just not a real thing. As an engineer who's been asked occasionally to build things that might actually be infinite machines, I can tell you that it's not true. More completely than that, I think, to pick up on one of Genevieve's points, one of the things about people who make technology is that when we imagine the thing that we're making and we imagine the places that it can go and we cast ourselves into the future, we cast ourselves into the future from our particular personal and cultural perspective. And so, I'm always struck by the dystopian future visions that people from the Western world have around where AI and robots are going to go, compared to the rather more benign visions of other cultures. For example, the way that people from the Japanese cultures think about the way that robots engage with human beings is utterly different to the way that people from, for example, the West Coast of America think about robots. So I think, I have issues. have issues with the basis from which people are casting forward the idea of a singularity from a cultural perspective and just from a pragmatic engineering perspective. It strikes me that in order for that actually to come off, it requires an infinite amount of resources, which we know that this planet does not have.
Now, lest anyone think I'm watching too many Terminator movies, I think there is a sense out there, though, that technology disruption is occurring at a much faster rate, that there was a time when we didn't have an Apple iPhone and now we can't live without it. That wasn't such a long time ago. So, Mikaela, your thoughts on, the rapidity of technological development, and sure, the singularity concept has now been pushed out beyond my lifetime. So where do you see it from your perspective?
I was just going to agree with everything that Genevieve and Elanor said, and add water as well into that mix, because water is our most precious resource. Our peoples have always known that, have always built our cultures around protecting water. And I think we're going to enter into a period in the too distant future. I'm wearing my environmental biology hat now, that we will be competing with industries for water for human consumption and food production. And I think that's going to be one of the limiting factors in developing tech. I also think in terms of the technology, thinking about the journey of technology, not just powering it and maintaining it, but also something that Genevieve taught us a lot about was the decommissioning of technology. We're seeing tons and tons and tons of e-waste that we're not really doing anything with, and people are starting to have their water systems poisoned by this e-waste and have real human impacts by the e-waste. So thinking about with technology, I think, though it is advancing rapidly, we're turning a lot more of our thinking into how do we make it into more of a circular economy, because we can see the writing on the wall about these finite resources and the impact that the decommissioning of the technology is having on communities across the world. And I don't know if you saw Four Corners recently about the cobalt, how that's even mined, the environmental and the social governance structures of corporations that develop this technology and push it to consumers are now having to, I guess, reap what they sow in terms of fixing the decommissioning of it. So I think that's something that is really going to maybe slow down the consumer side of technology development in terms of phones, because we have to, it's no longer acceptable to broad populations to simply dump it in someone's country or to simply continue to extract it from someone's country.
Now, thank you, Mikaela, Elanor and Genevieve. I'm now going to our Q&A, which has come in over the last few moments. And we've got some pretty interesting questions. I'll direct this one to you, Genevieve. And one of our attendees says, cybernetics was originally born from the conflict of the Second World War. We sit here at a minute to midnight, 80 years later, as conflict once more scars the world. What can cybernetics offer us in the search for peace? Genevieve, over to you.
Oh, well, it's a good and it's a good question because it's the right question to be asking. Cybernetics did occur in a moment akin to this, a moment of much transformation. I think some of the lessons that my team and I here would draw from history that I think informs us today is that part of the questions we should be asking ourselves as we contemplate the next things we build have to do with what is the intention of the system, like what is the world it is building and for whom and why, and how are we clear that every technology actually has a point of view that way? It imagines a world, its makers imagine a world. I turn out, I guess, in some ways controversially, not to believe that technology is neutral. I think that technology is deeply, deeply, deeply embedded in things, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't build it, but it does mean you should be much more aware about what you're doing as you build it. I think it also is really clear from the earlier conversations that started in cybernetics that the idea of contemplating a technical system without simultaneously thinking about the human and the ecological systems is both dangerous, and that way lies misery and dragons. And I think there's a very clear kind of sense that pulls out of the earlier conversations that when you bring together the system and say the system is always and already human and ecological and technical, and you actually have to be constantly and consciously thinking about the intersections and relationships between those things, it is far less likely that you will develop systems that are in some ways run out of control. All of that said, of course, it is always a complicated dance, right, between people who build systems and the way those systems can be used for other purposes. We've seen that repeatedly. For me, I think the two other enduring legacies of cybernetics that I find are powerful in the 21st century, one of them is about the notion of productive discomfort, that there is power in convening voices into a conversation that don't always agree with each other, and that you have to find a way to hold that conversation together and to get to a point where people are bringing different ideas and ways of thinking to the table and finding a space where that creates something new, not just discord. And that takes a lot of work. I'm sure you will remember that from your previous existence, and indeed, I suspect in some ways your current one. There's an art and a science to how you hold disparate voices into a conversation that moves forward. And then I think the other thing that I find extraordinary about some of my and my team's intellectual forebearers is that they also understood this notion of a kind of, it's a weird word to use, but grace, that you needed to build an idea with enough solidity that it would hold its form, but with enough room that other people could do things with it. And, when I look at Mick's work and the work of many of our other students here and who have graduated, one of the things that I think characterizes most of what they're doing is that it has a clear point of view and a clear direction, but they also fully understand that at some point someone's going to want to do something else with it. And you need to build it strong enough so that it holds, but with enough room so that it can find other purposes. And when I look at the conversation and the place we are now, those are the things I'd hope for.
Thanks, Genevieve. Elanor, I'm going to throw this one to you. It's from Paul, a Tesla driver. Paul says he operates an AI system, traffic aware, cruise control, auto steer. How do I negotiate the shared responsibility for system safety between me and Tesla? Is there scope for collective or legal action to hold the vendor to account, even though I've agreed to terms that say I'm completely responsible?
Cripes, I'm really not qualified to provide legal advice on this particular issue.
I don't think anybody is just yet. I think this is a very grey area and growing area. But it's an interesting one. If you don't want to answer, anybody else got a thought? Or Elanor, have a go at it and then see what Mikaela and Genevieve have to say.
So I will hand over to you and the other panellists, but actually I think you've hit the nail on the head, Chancellor, which is that this is actually an open question at the moment. And one of the key issues that many of us have been wrestling with is technology that was created in one set of legal constructs, say in America, that then gets exported to Australia. What does that actually mean? And where do we go with that? There's a whole other set of interesting conversations about how one might come at this from the other direction, which is how one might operationalize regulations from the regulations rather than the other direction. But from as far as I understand, it's an open question. But I will defer to more qualified colleagues on this panel.
Well, and Chancellor, what's interesting is it's Paul with this Tesla, absolutely, but it turns out anyone who has a certain brand of combine harvesters will find the same challenge. So what we're actually starting to see is a open set of conversations about what you might otherwise call the right to repair. So in the land of combine harvesters, if you buy them from a particular set of vendors, effectively you are no longer allowed to crack the box and start fiddling with the engine because you've been sold a complete data collection set. So it is no longer just a farm equipment, it's a data collection point. And Elanor, the other interesting thing about Tesla is that whilst it might have been created in a regulatory regime in America, even that regime is up for grabs. So when Hurricane Sandy happened on the east coast of the United States a couple of years back, one of the things that the Tesla Corporation did was reach down the wire to basically every Tesla in a particular set of geolocated areas. So already demonstrating they knew where they were. They geo-fenced them, and they then basically unlocked the battery life to all of the Teslas in that geo region and gave them a 24-hour battery rather than 12. Which caused most of the owners to realize that they had been sold an object that was capped, although it could be uncapped, and that it could be modified without their consent or buy-in. And while it was done with clear good intentions, as in you should be able to evacuate out of an area and maybe being able to have a car that will run 24 hours is better than 12, it created a really interesting moment of a sense of, wait, hey, what? Which built on top of the one that had happened with Kindle 2 years previously, where suddenly people found a whole lot of their books disappeared out of their Kindle libraries and reappeared with new text in them, which was a very different relationship than you might have had with Dimmix, because I don't think Dimmix is coming to my house, knocking on my door, taking my books away and giving me back different ones, at least not today.
Hey, Mikaela, there's one directly for you. Maya from the Northern Territory says, I'm wondering about the impact of writing and the internet on First Nation cultures. Maybe Maya's just tuned in, but perhaps just give us a response to that one, Mikaela.
Okay, so as in Western words on a two-dimensional internet, is that the context?
I think so, because that's the way I'm reading it.
Okay, well, that's a really hard question to answer, because as a Cabral woman, I've grown up being taught, obviously, how to speak a different language to my native tongue and how to read and write and how to use the internet. I think it's allowed us to express ideas in different ways. There's an incredible volume of incredible Indigenous authors that have come out over the last 50 years that have inspired people to think differently about all sorts of things. And I'm particularly enjoying the cyberpunk and the science fiction writing that's coming out of our communities at the moment. Unbelievable and incredible. So I love that we have these new tools to express our culture.
Hey, Mick.
Yeah.
Who should everyone be reading? Who's the most interesting First Nations science fiction? I've got Wraith on my shelf and loved it, but who else should people be reading?
I think actually if you follow Bronwyn Carlson, she's really great at curating lots of up-and-coming authors. So I think, if you look at Bronwyn's work and her collections, she captures a lot of really interesting thinking in like what they call compendiums of works, which is where a lot of incredible thought bubbles come from. But I think there is a downside as well. So I've seen my own community and some communities torn apart by the written word too. Like, how do you spell something? How do you even spell Capricorn? Our communities are grappling with this from having really intense conversations about, is it a C or is it a G? And my perspective is it doesn't matter because we never wrote it. So it's the way that we say our tongue is the most important, not the way that we write it down. And are we going to need that much writing in metaverse type environments? I don't know. But something else that has happened too is when AI has detected our language in social media channels, it's wrongly identified it as other languages. And I've had an instance where an elder was typing a really beautiful message to me in social media, and another Doric woman, because we both just won some awards, and it was a really humbling moment for our people to be recognised in this space. And the AI translated it into swear words and really offensive language because it had done this automatic language translation, and there was no consent from our people to even use our language in that platform and platforms like it. So we can be quite hurt by when AI takes our language and does that, that really deeply hurt my elder, and it really deeply hurt our community to the point where a lot of people like, do we want to work with these organisations because they haven't initiated free, prior and informed consent about us being able to express our cultures in these platforms. So there's some benefits and there's some not so great things that have happened out of having our languages in the written word and in the two-dimensional internet. And I really want to make sure that we have the opportunity to not repeat these same mistakes in Web 3.0.
Well, that takes us to another question from Anita. What is the role of regulation? I might go to you, Genevieve. What is the role of regulation of big tech's work in AI and big data? Will we always be playing catch up because the regulators don't understand the technology?
I think it is always a complicated dance, right? We have a bunch of legislation in Australia and globally that has very clear guardrails about things that run the gamut from privacy to security to what kinds of data is constituted in what ways and available to whom. Of course, most of those laws and regulations didn't anticipate technology that could scale globally and instantaneously, and didn't anticipate the fact that it would work transnationally. So, part of the challenge, is certainly been the case in Australia, is that many of the technologies that we use in our daily lives and the platforms that we rely on are built and regulated elsewhere. And, we've certainly seen over the last sort of 5 years in Australia some clearly complicated conversations going on between us and large tech companies about how we felt about their platforms and the way they might want to get used here. I think there's also other conversations that those are a part and parcel about how things do and don't move globally and how we want to think about those things. For me, I take some small comfort in the fact that regulatory frameworks around new technologies haven't always been slow. And the different kind of categories of regulations tend to be interesting, right? When the railways first came along, the very first laws passed in Britain were about safety and then about equity of access. And those laws were passed within 2 years of the first railway companies coming into existence. It took another 30 years for them to work out how to standardize time so that the railways could flow readily. And, we saw similar things happen in Australia with the introduction of the telegraph system. And about, what was appropriate to carry on the telegraph and what it meant to interrupt telegraph lines and all that sort of stuff. So I think sometimes the legislation is already there or versions of it are there, and it's a matter of making sure we're asking the right questions. And then sometimes it's about making sure that we are thinking both about the immediate case and the edge cases. I think it's sometimes tempting to say, this thing has happened, we need to create a piece of law about it right now, as opposed to saying, is this an instantiation of a pattern we're going to see over and over again, or is this an edge case? And in both instances, how do we take a step back and ask, what is the broader sort of conversation we want to have here? I mean, there's a lot of different laws on the books in Australia at the moment, and there's probably an argument about harmonising some of them.
A question from Loki says, as a technologist, lawyer, and human-centric designer, I'm interested in the intersections between law, human systems, and how we govern and struggle through these issues. And then adds, should we be intervening in the pace of technological change to get time to consider the implications? Can we? Which goes somewhat to Mikaela's point about the translation of her language into swear words. I mean, we need to get the implications right. We need to understand the implications and get them right. Elanor, your thoughts on that?
So I guess I'd actually come at this from a couple of different directions. One of which is, if we think in terms of regulation, legislation, governance, all of that sort of stuff, one of the things that Australia is actually should be proud about is that we are actually an incredibly progressive and globally leading country in terms of exporting ideas around this sort of stuff. While we often berate ourselves internally around, we're not great at technology, we're not great at commercialization, all of that sort of stuff. We are great at really good ideas that can take off, and examples include the Australian vote, the way that we do voting. Some of our legislation around tobacco is obviously world leading. We've done some amazing stuff around that. And Australia has actually done incredibly well. We've got an e-safety commissioner. We've got legislation that is sitting around that particular position, and that's an idea that lots of other countries are looking to pick up. So we are good at that, and a lot of the time it comes from the perspective of thinking about the impact of these things on people and building legislation around the consequences. That actually buys us the kind of time that this question is starting to speak to, because there's a layer of regulation and specific legislation that sits around particular technologies that, as Genevieve said, we can move fast, but sometimes we're not ahead of it. But if we keep ourselves thinking in terms of what is the impact of this stuff on people, Australia is actually really good at thinking about that, and we are really good at throwing the ball forward and being out in front around that. And I'll point out that's actually a systems engineering approach to think in terms of what the system's meant to achieve as opposed to its performance measures, but that's a whole other conversation. We are good at that, and I think that if we keep focusing on that and allow the legislation and regulations and standards and all of that sort of stuff that sit specifically on top of the technologies, if we allow that to come in slightly slower time, that's a good balance of different timescales. And I think the issue here is to think on different timescales so that we can actually get ahead at times, but not so far ahead that it's ossified by the time that technology catches up.
Okay, I'm just going to give one last question for the panel, and we're just wrapping up. So the last question, and it's a really tough one, it's from Tim. Do you believe there are aspects of mass communications technology that undermine democracy? Will solutions be found in the advancement of democratic systems or the regulation of technology, or maybe both? Mikaela, I'll start with you.
Wow, thanks for throwing out the big question, Chancellor.
No problem.
Yeah, I think obviously there has been some interference with big tech and data in the way, and particularly in elections and other things. I think the whole concept of the metaverse being underpinned by blockchain is people trying to buck that trend where all the power is in big tech companies and governments. But I do wonder, as someone who lives in two cultures, if the Western influence or the Western way of thinking about democracy is really going to work for everyone, and we're constructing a whole metaverse on a Western ideology of fairness and equity and ethics. And I often wonder about how would that be deployed in my own communities for something like a DAO, like a decentralized autonomous organization, and where is our opportunity to put forward our concepts of what's fair and ethical decision-making, particularly around how we spend money, which is the underpinning concept of DAOs. Yeah.
Elanor, sorry.
Sure. So if I might actually just pick up on Mikaela's thread there, and there's an even more granular example around the idea of what do we mean by democracy, and it actually comes from my personal lived experience through the COVID pandemic, where around the time that we were in the lull between the Delta and the Omicron waves, and everyone was kind of used to the idea that you would use your QR code check-in to go into all of a range of various venues. And we got used to the idea that, in fact, if we tested positive, a robot, or at least the government, would contact all of the people who needed to be contacted in order for them to understand that they were a close contact. When the QR code check-in went away, we were actually somewhat disconcerted and a little bit grumpy because we felt that work was being pushed onto us. So we actually thought of that piece of technology as being infrastructure that supported us, and that came from a particular Australian way of thinking about what is the role of government in our lives. I was talking with somebody who has an Australian who's lived in America for a very long time, who was really quite anxious about the idea that they even needed to check in at all because it felt like overreach from the government into our personal lives. So there's even really very granular sense of what does technology and democracy mean, even just in the difference between Australia and America. Honestly, this is a very complicated question, and in the end, we're going to make the kind of democracy that we want with the technology that we use to do that.
Genevieve, the last word is yours.
Oh God, no pressure then. So I suspect, as the anthropologist, what I'd want to say is that democracy and press are two concepts that are also culturally constructed. I mean, Eleanor's quite right, and I'm sure, Chancellor, you would know this from lived experience. When people say the word democracy, what they mean in the United States and Australia are two very different things. My American colleagues routinely would be horrified to be told that voting was compulsory. They would tell me that was undemocratic and unfair and wrong, and how could I even stand it? And I'd look at them and go, you don't vote? Like, what is wrong with you? And so I think, the notion of what is democracy and how we think about its institutions and how we think about its apparatus looks really different across the world, as does what we talk about when we talk about the press. All of that said, I think we're at a point where technologies allow words to move at a speed and scale that is different than we have seen in the past. While, the telegraph might have, made things move 99.9% faster in a 2-year window back in the 1850s, it now is not point to point, it's point to every point. And there's something about that ability to get to instantaneous scale. And as the pieces of information have gotten even smaller, there's a way where I think we're running this interesting moment where it's low on meaning, high on symbol. And if you want to think about why it is that TikTok works and why it is that tweets work, it's because it's in some ways smaller fragments of meaning. And the consequence of that is it is both harder to tell meaningful stories and easier for people to attribute multiple meanings to the same story. And those things are complicated when it comes to thinking about cultural continuities.
Thank you. Now that brings to an end the ANU Chancellor's panel on Frontiers of AI. I thank our audience for joining us today and for the great questions to the panel, and I trust that you found this discussion to be thought-provoking and useful in your endeavours. As to our expert panel, Genevieve, Elanor, Mikaela, thank you so much for your insightful discussion, the work you are doing at the leading edges in your fields. So everyone, thanks for joining us. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.